Chapter 14. The Social Contract Tradition. Problems and Prospects. Why be moral? Most moral theories have tried to show how, on their terms, it is rational to be moral and irrational to be immoral. Social contract theorists are no exception. The classic statement of this contractarian aim is given in Hobbes's Leviathan. Hobbes discusses the views of the calculating amoralist, whom he terms the fool. The fool admits that breaking his promises is unjust, but he doesn't care about whether his actions are just or not. He cares only about his own self-interest. When keeping his promises will do him good, he'll keep his promises. When it won't, he won't. He reasons that he'll sometimes do best for himself by being unjust. When that is so, it is rational to act immorally. Hobbes faces the challenge directly. He agrees with the fool's basic assumption that self-interest is the fundamental reason for acting. On this line of thinking, you are rational to the extent that you increase your chances of becoming better off. Thus, Hobbes has to show that acting morally is always likely to promote self-interest. That's not so easy. The specific case Hobbes considers is one in which the fool has made a deal with someone else, and the other person has already done what he's promised to do. Should the fool keep his side of the bargain anyway? Many will say no. Their advice is simple. Take the money and run. That's certainly immoral, but people can get away with their immorality. It has happened many times. In such cases, people get what they want without having to give up anything in return. It's a black eye for justice, but it seems the height of rationality. Hobbes disagrees. He allows that people sometimes get away with injustice, but that doesn't make it rational to act unjustly. Unjust acts are rational only if they increase the likelihood of personal gain, and Hobbes says that they never do. Though people can sometimes get away with injustice, the chances of doing so are never good, so injustice is never rational. One way to defend Hobbes's conclusion is to raise the possibility of divine wrath. If you are immoral, then God is going to punish you, and no matter the worldly riches you're after, they simply aren't worth that misery. But Hobbes tosses this aside. The fool he is considering is the same fool who has said in his heart that there is no God, so the threat of divine punishment isn't going to work. We can make the challenge hardest for Hobbes by considering a classic puzzle of rationality, the Freerider Problem. This occurs when lots of folks are cooperating in a way that brings some common good. So long as enough people are chipping in, this benefit can be enjoyed by all, even those who refuse to help out. These are the free riders. They are getting a free ride by exploiting the efforts of others without making any sacrifices themselves. This refusal to contribute to the support of the common good seems highly unfair, but it also seems highly rational. Let's make this more concrete. Consider some shared public goods: keeping a park clean, maintaining a high level of decency in society, having democratic elections, eliminating a dreadful disease, having a secure national defense, having government agencies ensure the safety of our food, medicines, and highways. These are genuine goods, and yet they can be achieved only if most people in a society are contributing to them. Such contributions involve sacrifice, sometimes small, making time to vote, not tossing a wrapper to the ground, and sometimes potentially large, serving in the military, paying your tax bill. In many of these cases, the contribution that any single individual makes is negligible. Democracy isn't going to crumble if I decide not to vote. The park won't be totally spoiled if I drop my gum wrapper on the grass. The government agencies will continue to do their work with or without my tax payment. Since that's so, I might reason as follows. The particular resource doesn't depend on my contribution. It will still be there whether I contribute or not. So why make the sacrifice? I can gain the benefit of free elections or a secure national defense without taking the time to vote or serve in the military. I am not doing my fair share to support the common good, but I am getting something for nothing. How could that be irrational? Of course, if you already care about not exploiting your fellow citizens, then it will be rational for you to make the needed sacrifices to help support these common goods. You won't see voting, getting immunized, or paying taxes as a nasty burden, but rather as your contribution to causes that you wholeheartedly support. But suppose you don't feel this way, or you do, but are starting to wonder whether you are being a dupe. Hobbes doesn't assume that we are generous and public-minded. He is trying to show the person who is entirely self-interested why it would be a good bet even for him to do his fair share. Can he do it? There are two things we might say on Hobbes's behalf. First, we might argue, as he himself did, that the risks of doing wrong always outweigh its potential benefits, but this is simply mistaken. There are cases in which the chances of being found out are low, or the punishments are pretty mild, and the benefits of injustice are really substantial. Since rationality, for Hobbes, is all about how much gain you can reasonably expect from an action, injustice can sometimes be highly rational. What Hobbes could say is that it is never rational to behave unjustly in a well-ordered society. For him, such a society is one that offers reliable threats against breaking mutually beneficial rules. It won't be rational to cheat on your taxes, for instance, if the penalties for doing so are very severe and you are sure to get caught. However, in our imperfect world, where enforcement isn't foolproof, where punishments are sometimes pretty light, it can indeed be rational to take a chance at injustice. So long as we understand rationality as Hobbes does, as maximizing the chances of doing well for yourself, then he cannot show that injustice is always irrational. But Hobbes might be able to show something nearly as comforting. Compare two claims. 1. No matter who you are, or what circumstances you find yourself in, it is always rational to act justly. 2. It is always rational to be a just person, the sort of person who values fairness, approves of just policies, tries to live an upright life, and becomes upset when learning of injustice. Hobbes cannot defend Claim 1, but he might be able to defend Claim 2, and if he can, then he may also be able to show the following. 3. For just people, it is always rational to act justly. And that would be a lot, even if it is a bit disappointing in leaving us without a surefire reply to the vicious person bent on doing evil. Here is the best shot for Hobbes at defending Claim 2. In the long run, just people are more likely to do better for themselves than unjust people. The upright person sleeps well at night. She has true friends. She has people she can share her delights with, be consoled by, confide her hopes and fears to. She isn't always looking over her shoulder, wondering whether the police are after her. She can review her life with satisfaction, knowing that she has earned the trust of others. The life of virtue has a lot going for it. Compare such a life with that of an immoral criminal, one who is always worrying whether a vengeful victim or a turncoat conspirator is hard on his heels. It is a life of great insecurity. Those always on the lookout for the main chance, for the opportunity to cheat someone or exploit the system, are playing a losing game. They might win a few hands along the way, but there's not much in it as a long-term strategy. It isn't rational to be the cheating type. If this is right, then it is rational to be a virtuous person, and that is what Claim 2 says. Further, if it is rational to be such a person, it is rational to try to stay that way. The best strategy for maintaining your good character is to keep on doing good things. For once we begin to give in to temptation, immorality can slowly chip away at virtue. It can be very hard to put on the brakes and prevent a slide into real corruption. Thus, for good people, it is rational to continue to act justly and to resist the call to stray from the path of virtue. That is precisely what Claim 3 says. That is the best case to be made for Claims 2 and 3, and yet it also fails, or rather, it isn't a complete success. It may be rational to be a moral person in societies that are well-ordered, stable, and largely just, but when corruption is rampant and the powerful can get away with most things, then virtue can be a recipe for disaster. Take the case of Marlene Garcia Esperat. She was a journalist investigating corruption in the Philippine Department of Agriculture. The corruption went deep, and it reached very high levels. In order to protect themselves, officials in the department ordered her death. In 2005, a man knocked at her door, wished her good morning, and then killed her in front of her children. Between 1986 and 2006, 56 Philippine journalists were murdered, either in retaliation for their coverage or to prevent them from breaking the news of illegal activities among the wealthy elite. Garcia Esperat's case was unusual in only one way. It was the first in 20 years in which the murderers were brought to trial. These sort of tactics aren't confined to the Philippines, of course. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, over 617 journalists have been murdered around the world since 1992. Reporters and editors and whistleblowers, peace activists, and others intent on exposing immorality often end up paying the ultimate price for their bravery. Hobbes takes a hard-eyed view of human nature and denies that virtue is its own reward. If he is right about that, then it pays to be good only when that promises a longer life, a more secure existence, or a better chance at getting what you want. It sometimes will, but not always. When it doesn't, Hobbesian rationality requires that you make injustice your master. The role of consent. Most of us believe that we have a moral duty to honor our commitments, and a contract is a commitment. It is a promise given in exchange for some expected benefit. A social contract differs from other contracts only in the extent of the duties it imposes and the benefits it creates. Since we are morally required to keep our promises, we have a duty to honor the terms of the social contract. But have we actually promised to live up to any social contract? The Pilgrims did when they paused before the shores of Massachusetts and together signed the Mayflower Compact in 1620. In ancient Athens, free men were brought to the public forum and directly asked to promise obedience to their city or leave without penalty. Naturalized citizens in the United States have long been required to pledge allegiance to the nation's laws, but relatively few adults nowadays have done any such thing. It seems, therefore, that we are not really parties to any such contract, and so are not bound to obey its terms. Some philosophers have tried to finesse this point by arguing that we actually have agreed to obey the law. True, most of us haven't signed any contract or stated out loud that we are prepared to follow the law. Instead, we have offered our tacit consent, which is expressed through silence and a lack of opposition to the government. Tacit consent is a possibility. When I ask my class whether it is okay to move on to a new topic and no one replies, I reasonably take it that everyone agrees to proceed. Likewise, we might signal our consent to the government's laws by staying put, by not calling for its overthrow, by continuing to reap the benefits of civilized society. But this is problematic. Some people loudly call for revolution. They are not tacitly consenting to obey the law. Others might be unable to voice their opposition freely for fear of what the authorities will do. The fact that they remain where they are is no sign of their consent. It's simply evidence of a very practical decision. In many such cases, individual protest is unlikely to lead to better times, and is very likely to lead to imprisonment, torture, or an early death. How many political prisoners have learned this lesson the hard way? How many others have been deterred by their example? The defender of tacit consent might reply that if people were rational and saw the horrors of the state of nature, they would agree to being governed under the present terms, even if such terms are not ideal. And therefore, since people are, on the whole, pretty rational, we can assume that they have given at least their tacit consent to being governed by the existing laws. Thus it seems that many people have neither explicitly nor tacitly consented to the rules that govern their society. The reasoning here is summarized by the consent argument. 1. We have a duty to obey the law only if we have consented to do so. 2. Many have not given their consent to obey the law. 3. Therefore, many people do not have a duty to obey the law. I have just given some reason to think that the second premise is true. Still, the argument works only if the first premise is also true. Its supporters claim that governments can be terribly abusive, and so their power can be justified only if it respects the will of its citizens, and that requires the citizens' consent to being governed. An essential part of government is its power to force its people to do what it says, but as a general matter, it is wrong to coerce people without their consent. Why should it be any different when the threat is coming from the government rather than a private citizen? That is the strongest case for premise 1. Here's the strongest case against it. Suppose you hate your country and reject its basic laws. You remain only because your government refuses to allow you to leave or because other, better countries won't let you in. You really truly do not consent to your government's authority. Does that mean that you have no duty to obey its rules? That you are morally free to break laws against theft and slander and battery and murder just because you renounce your membership in the social contract? That is the implication of premise 1. It is very hard to accept. It is even harder to accept when we turn our focus away from questions of obedience to the law and ask, instead, about basic moral duties. It is very implausible to suppose that we are morally required to do only what we agree to do. We have a moral obligation to help the needy, even if we can't be bothered to think of their plight. Abusive bosses are morally required to be decent to their workers, even if the bosses deny this and have made no promise to do so. Contractarianism would be in deep trouble if it claimed that our moral duties applied only to those who agreed to accept them, but it makes no such claim. The social contract that fixes our basic moral duties is not one that any of us has actually consented to. Rather, it is one that we each would agree to, were we all free and rational and seeking terms of mutually beneficial cooperation. So the fact that we have never signed a social contract or verbally announced our allegiance to one does not undermine the contractarian project. Contractarianism does not require you to do whatever the existing laws and social customs tell you to do. Those standards are partly a product of ignorance, past deception and fraud, and imperfect political compromise. We are morally required to live up to the standards that free, rational people would accept as the terms of their cooperative living. It's safe to say that no existing set of laws perfectly lines up with those terms. Thus, contractarianism isn't a simple recipe to do whatever your society says. Rather, it provides a way to evaluate society's actual rules by seeing how close or how far they are to the ideal social code that would be adopted if we were freer, more equal, and more rational than we are. If contractarianism is correct, this ideal social code is the moral law. Disagreement among the contractors. If the social contract theory is correct, then the moral rules are those that free, equal, and rational people would agree to live by. But what happens if such people disagree with one another? For instance, what if these contractors can't reach a deal about the conditions under which a nation should go to war, or about the kind of aid we owe to the very poor? What happens to them? Rawls solved this problem by making every contractor a clone of every other. Behind the veil of ignorance, all of your distinguishing features go away. No one is any different from anyone else, and so there is no reason to expect any disagreement. But Hobbes and other contractarians won't stand for this. They can't see why I should follow the rules of someone who is so completely unlike me, a person who is not only absolutely rational but also stripped of all knowledge of his social status, his friendships and family situation, his desires, interests, and hopes. Hobbes and his followers insist that the moral rules are those that we, situated as we are, would rationally agree to, provided, of course, that others would agree to live by them as well. It's not easy to know how to solve this disagreement between contractarians. On one hand, Rawls's view is likely to be fairer, since any information that could prejudice our choices is kept from us as we select rules to live by. But Hobbes also has a point in that we want to make it rational, if we can, for everyone to live by the moral rules. Why should I live according to the rules set by some person who isn't at all like the real me? That's a pretty good question. I'm sure that you've already figured out that I am not able to answer every good ethical question. This is another one I am going to leave for your consideration. Instead, let's return to our original problem. What should we say when the people choosing the social rules disagree with one another? Perhaps Rawls is right, and there won't be any disagreement. But what if he's wrong? If contractors disagree, then the actions or policies they disagree about are morally neutral. They are neither required nor forbidden. That's because the moral rules are ones that all contractors would agree to. If there are some matters that they can't agree on, then these are not covered by the moral rules. This could be pretty bad, or it might just be fine. It all depends on where the disagreement arises, if it ever does. If there are only small pockets of disagreement regarding relatively trivial matters, then this is hardly a problem. But what if contractors can't agree about war policy, about whether executions are just, about how to treat the poorest among us? Then this is really serious, since we do think that morality must weigh in on these issues. So how much disagreement will there be? There is no easy way to know. We can provide answers only after we know how to describe the contractors and their position of choice. Will they be clones of one another, situated behind the veil of ignorance, or will they be aware of their different personalities and life situations? Will they be more or less equally situated, or are some going to have a lot more leverage than others? When we say that they are rational, do we have Kant's conception in mind, or Hobbes's, according to which rationality amounts to reliably serving your self-interest? Or some other conception? Answers to these questions will make a big difference in deciding on the specific moral rules that a social contract theory favors. These answers will also determine the amount of agreement we can expect from the contractors. There is no shortcut to discovering these answers. To get them, contractarians must defend their own specific version of the theory against competing versions. That is a major undertaking. Until it is done, we cannot know just what the moral rules are, or how much contractual disagreement to expect. The scope of the moral community. The true measure of a man is how he treats someone who can do him absolutely no good. Samuel Johnson. Who has rights? Who deserves our respect? Utilitarians have their answer. Anyone, or any animal, who can suffer harm. Kantians have their answer. Anyone who is rational and autonomous. And contractarians have theirs. Anyone whose interests are protected by the rules that contractors will agree upon. When coming together to negotiate rules to live by, who will the contractors decide to protect? Different social contract theorists give different answers. The key to understanding them, however, lies in the idea that the contractors are, above all, rational and self-interested. It's easy to see why they should be rational, but why assume that they are self-interested? There is a two-part answer. First, the preliminary part. Being self-interested is not the same thing as being selfish. Being self-interested is having a strong concern for how well you are faring in life. Being selfish is placing far too much importance on your own well-being relative to the interests of others. We don't have to assume that contractors are selfish, but they definitely do care about how well off they will be under the agreed-on rules of cooperation. Okay, fair enough. But the real question is whether we should think of the contractors as also being generous, benevolent, and self-sacrificing. And the answer that contractarians give is no. Why is that? Well, by assigning such virtues to the contractors, social contract theorists could be accused of stacking the deck in favor of moral principles that we already agree on. The attractions of proceduralism would be lost, since we would be starting our moral inquiry by making substantive assumptions about what is right and wrong, namely that it is right to be generous, benevolent, and self-sacrificing, and wrong to be the opposite. And we would also be making it more difficult to show people why it is rational for them to obey the moral rules, since some of us are not that virtuous. Some people would take a look at the rules that a bunch of awfully nice, sweet people agreed to and roll their eyes in disgust. There's no way that they are going to live by those rules. The assumption, then, is that everyone is to some degree self-interested, and that it is rational to be that way. Now back to our original question. If you are choosing from a position of equality, are free and highly rational, with a healthy dose of self-interest, who will you assign rights to? The answer is other people like you. Contractors, those free, equal, and rational people engaged in the project of negotiating rules to live by, are the ones who will receive special treatment. Contractors have a few defining features. First, they are both potential threats and potential benefactors. They can return our good deeds, but can also dish out some nasty treatment in response to being harmed. Second, they are fundamentally our equals. They have roughly the same powers as we do, including powers to help us and to hurt us. And third, we must be unable to gain anything from them without their consent. In other words, we must enter agreements with them in order to obtain benefits from them and protection against them. At first blush, it seems strange that membership in the moral community should be limited to contractors, but it makes good sense, once we recall the Hobbesian view of rationality. According to Hobbes, sacrifice requires compensation. When we escape from the state of nature, for instance, we give up a great many freedoms. But it is worth it because of the promise of a better life, the sort that comes from being able to trust and rely on others. Now here's the crucial question. If we can get what we really want without having to sacrifice anything, then why should we make the sacrifice? If Hobbes is right, there is no answer to this question. There is no reason to make such a sacrifice. We can get what we want from trees, from animals, from the very weak, without having to give anything in return. And so we have no reason to treat such beings with respect. They don't meet the conditions of being a contractor. We could decide to be nice to them. We could choose, for instance, to let a chicken live rather than kill it and eat it, or let a lab rat go free rather than submit it to painful experiments. But that is charity. It isn't duty. We have no duties to such vulnerable beings because our duties are limited to contractors, those we have reason to respect because they can harm us if we don't and can benefit us if we do. We can't just take what we want from contractors. We need to give up something in exchange for their beneficial cooperation. In short, you get moral status, have rights, and are owed respect just in case your cooperation is needed in order for others to benefit. You have to be a member of the social contract in order to have genuine moral importance. Plants aren't members since we can use them as we like without giving them anything in return. Ditto for animals and the very weak among us. That is why membership in the moral community is limited to contractors. They are the only ones with whom it is rational to enter a social contract. For all other beings, we'd be giving something up, freedom to exploit them, without gaining anything in return. According to Hobbes, that is irrational. Thus, contractarianism offers no secure protection for the truly vulnerable. We could, if we like, ensure their protection, but reason does not require us to do so, since we can get what we want from them without having to sacrifice anything in return. We are to them as a much more powerful and indestructible alien race would be to us. Such creatures, if they felt like it, might be nice to us, but since there is nothing in it for them to treat us this way, theory, neither reason nor morality requires that they offer us their respect. They'd be perfectly within their rights to snack on us day and night. This is because morality, on the social contract view, comes from rules of beneficial cooperation that rational parties would agree to. Rational, all-powerful aliens wouldn't agree to limit their liberty in exchange for anything we might do for them, since we can't hurt them and they can get whatever they want from us without giving anything up on their end. If the social contract theory is correct, then animals, ecosystems, infants, and the severely retarded are in the same position as we readers are in the fictional example I've just presented. It's very bad news for us if such a race ever pays the Earth a visit. In the meantime, it's very bad news indeed for all the vulnerable among us. Conclusion. Contractarianism starts with a very promising idea. Morality is essentially a social matter, and is made up of the rules that we would accept if we were free, equal, and fully rational. The heart of the theory is an ideal social code that serves as the true standard for what is right and wrong. This theory has a lot going for it, as we've seen. It offers us a procedure for evaluating moral claims, and so offers the promise of being able to justify even our most basic moral views. It has an interesting explanation of the objectivity of morality. It can explain why we are often bound to obey the law and why we may sometimes break it. It has an appealing account of why we should punish criminals. It can explain why it is usually, though not always, rational to behave morally. That's a very impressive list. Like all other popular moral theories, however, it is not perfect. There are those who are disappointed with the theory because it leaves open the possibility that immoral actions are rational. Whether this is a serious problem, however, is still up in the air, since it is very hard to know whether it is always rational to do your duty. Still, as we have just seen, the theory does have at least one truly worrying aspect. It denies that the neediest are members of our moral community, and so opens the way to their exploitation. I want to remind you that every moral theory we consider in this book is still a work in progress. Very smart philosophers continue to develop these theories, building on their strengths and trying to shore up their weaknesses. It's no different here. When it comes to assessing the social contract theory, I haven't offered the last word on its success. I've offered only the beginnings of the full picture. Those who find its vision of morality elegant and compelling are invited to think more about how it might be supported, while fans of its competitors must do the same for their favorite theory. Let's now have a look at more of the competition.